When humans get together in large numbers, bad things can happen. War is all fear and hate, and World War II remains the worst war we've ever seen. I don't think any belligerent state was without its atrocities and war crimes. Even the kindest of us can devolve into monsters, but it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to you that the Soviet Union was right up there with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. In this video, we're going to outline the atrocities of the USSR and its blood red army in the Second World War. The Soviet Union engulfed a whole lot of land before, during, and after the Second World War.
It's free real estate.
And one of its favorite things to do with the people living in that land was to boot them out of it. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and countries in those war-torn years, and many of those unfortunate souls were thrown deep into the USSR, as far as Siberia, which was basically a death sentence. Between 1939 and 1941, for instance, some 1.5 million people were deported out of Poland by the Soviets. This particular deportation was on a massive scale, but it happened elsewhere too. In Estonia, for instance, almost 11,000 people were deported by the Soviets in just 3 days, mostly in train cars designed for moving cattle. The Soviets deported people from their own territory too, such as farmers who owned anything over 8 acres of land, whom they considered to be a threat to Bolshevism, well-off Greek minorities, of which some 50,000 were booted out, and persons of Finnish descent living in the part of the USSR known back then as Ingria, of which some 76% had received the boot as early as 1939. On this latter example, after the end of the Continuation War, the Soviet Union was supposed to send the Ingrian Finns back to Ingria, but instead they forced them to settle in Siberia and Central Russia and Asia. While many deportees were simply ejected from their homes and countries, others were thrown into prisons, forced to carry out manual labor, or forced into military service. Prisoners, especially political prisoners, all through the Soviet Union and its occupation zones, were tortured to death for intelligence purposes, and sometimes just for entertainment. We'll get into military prisoners of war soon, but for now, we're mostly talking about civilian prisoners, of whom many were women and children. From Poland, for example, the Soviet NKVD took hundreds of thousands of political prisoners to camps in the USSR, where they cut off their fingers, ears, and noses, scalded them with boiling water, bound them together with barbed wire, and shot them to death, or simply left them to die of starvation and exposure, among other things. Others were delivered to gulags, which were Soviet forced labor camps. Gulags were torture in themselves, and few deported to them ever made it back home. In the years immediately after the war, hundreds of thousands of German civilians were deported to the gulags in the Soviet Union, where it's estimated that more than 200,000 of them perished due to starvation and disease. Instead of being imprisoned or worked to death, others still were forced to spill their blood in the Red Army throughout the war. In 1941, around 34,000 Estonians were added to the ranks of the Red Army, and only about 30% of them actually survived the war. Between 1940 and 1941, some 150,000 Poles were sent to war under Soviet flags against Finland and Germany. These are just a few of many examples. For other European civilians, death came more swiftly. Sometimes, the NKVD and their Red Army muscle found it easier to execute political prisoners on the spot, while other civilians became casualties of Soviet scorched-earth policies. In Kautla, Estonia, on the 24th of July 1941, for instance, Soviet destruction battalions set civilian farms and farmhouses on fire with their occupants still inside, and tortured other civilians to death, reducing the village's population by 30 in just one day. On the 26th of January 1945, in the Polish village of Prashowice, the Red Army massacred some 70 civilians, including women, children, and infants, some simply for trying to put out their burning homes. In Nemersdorf, East Prussia, on the 21st of October 1944, The Red Army massacred 74 German civilians and some 50 French and Belgian POWs, though not before torturing them for their own entertainment. According to a Wehrmacht officer who later discovered the scene, the Soviets had nailed some civilians to barn doors in cruciform positions. Again, these are just a few of many examples. Generally, Soviet destruction battalions plundered, murdered, and razed civilian settlements to the ground, just as high-up command had ordered them to do. This brings us to our next and most vulgar point. The Red Army raped hundreds of thousands of women and young girls before, during, and after the Second World War. In Poland alone, it's estimated that more than 100,000 females were raped by Red Army soldiers, leading to a countrywide STD pandemic which affected about 10% of the population after the war. In Hungary, rape victim estimates vary from 5,000 to 200,000. Of course, this occurred all throughout Germany too, and especially around the Battle of Berlin. The number of German women raped by the Soviet soldiers has been estimated to be as high as 2 million, and it's also estimated that some 240,000 of these victims were killed in the act or after it. In the words of British military historian Anthony Beevor, it was the greatest phenomenon of mass rape in history, and no women from 8 to 80 years old were spared. Similar atrocities occurred after the war in Europe, during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, in which the Red Army soldiers raped and massacred thousands of Japanese women and children. As one witness reported it, the soldiers were permitted by their commanders to carry out, in his words, 3 days of rape and pillage on a newly captured city. So far, we've mostly covered the atrocities inflicted by the Red Army soldiers on civilians. But what about military personnel? All in all, the Soviets tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, many after they had been taken as POWs, and many almost immediately after they had surrendered. It's estimated that as many as 3 million German soldiers, for instance, were captured by the Soviets throughout the war, with more than 380,000 of them perishing in captivity. Others reported the German death toll as high as 1 million, which is more than 33% of all German soldiers that were captured. Many of these POWs succumbed to starvation, disease, exposure, previously inflicted wounds, and Red Army violence. The Soviets carried out soldier massacres too, with the Katyn massacre being among the most infamous. Between April and May 1940, the NKVD executed some 22,000 Polish military personnel, purported spies and saboteurs, land and factory owners, and other, in quotation marks, undesirables in Katyn Forest in Russia and Kalinin and Kharkiv prisons in Russia and the Ukraine. What makes this massacre so scandalous is that the USSR first blamed it on the Nazis and then, in 1990, admitted to it. As it turned out, unsurprisingly, Stalin himself had approved of the massacre. While not quite on the same scale as Katyn, between the 29th of December 1941 and New Year's Day of 1942, the Red Army executed up to 160 German soldiers in the Crimean port city of Feodosia. Here, the Soviets mutilated the helpless soldiers, threw them out of windows, and soaked them in cold water so they would slowly freeze to death. Across several Ukrainian towns in February 1943, the Red Army took 596 Axis personnel prisoner, of which 508 were military and 88 were civilian. Not just Germans, but Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, and fellow Ukrainians too. Just like in Feodosia, the Soviets mutilated them horrifically, cutting pieces off their body and stuffing them into their mouths before killing them. Pretty atrocious and grim, right? But what we mustn't forget is that the Soviets weren't the only ones who did stuff like this, and this video, of course, doesn't detail what the soldiers of other nations, namely Germany, did to the soldiers and civilians of the USSR. Not to say that revenge is an excuse. It isn't. But what do you think? Was this a fair overview of Soviet atrocities in the Second World War? Can you think of any other atrocities the Soviets committed? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you go, guys, make sure you check out some of the links in the description down below, including our Patreon for exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, our Facebook and Instagram for the same thing, and our music channel if you want to hear the music we play in our videos unobstructed. But anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.